The Hudson is a corridor of history, holding some of this country's oldest memories. It has its beginnings high in the ancient rocks of the Adirondacks. The names given to the waters that combined to form the Hudson hark back to the first people who lived by this great river of the mountains. Lake Tear of the Cloud, Falls of Hanging Spear, and the forks originating in Calamity Mountain, Bad Luck, and Kettle Mountain. The many streams, Stony Creek, Wolf Creek, and Sacandaga. The early Dutch farmers who first settled the valley came from flat country that held no secrets. But the brooding Catskills, their jagged ridges often obscured in mist, set their imaginations aquiver. Legends, folklore, and frightening tales abound, even to this day. Widening, the Hudson runs southward through a great glacial channel. Here it becomes a long ocean inlet, with the Atlantic tides pushing their way upriver for 150 miles. The Algonquins called it the river that flows two ways. While the story of the Hudson begins geographically in the Adirondacks, it begins in terms of people at the entrance to the great harbor of New York City. The very first impression most visitors have not only of the Hudson, but of America herself. In the spring of 1968, Mrs. Lyndon Johnson turned back the pages of American history in a trip through the Hudson Valley. Her trip began with the dedication of the American Museum of Immigration, housed appropriately within the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. She opened the doors of the museum using 2 pairs of scissors brought to America a half-century earlier by tailors from the Old World.
The Museum of Immigration we dedicate symbolizes the new start that millions of people received in this country. The exhibits here remind us of what we as a people have been. They remind us that America was the willing recipient and fortunate beneficiary of the greatest mass migration in the history of mankind. Nothing like it had ever taken place before, and probably nothing like it ever will again. Nearly 45 million human beings have come to these shores since 1820. Every race, color, creed, they brought their worn, humble suitcases, their pictures of home, their bits of needlework, and their dreams. Though they came from all quarters, their love, their blood, their prayers, and their families united in this great nation, proving to the world that in union there is strength. To their descendants, I have no greater accolade to bestow than to say, the President and I embrace you in the common joy and pride of being fellow Americans.
Mrs. Johnson's excursion began, rightfully enough, on the water. And though her point of departure was the nation's biggest and most glamorous city, she would, within a matter of hours, chart a course through nearly 3 centuries of river history. Moving along the length of Manhattan Island, a traveler could easily see the efforts the new Americans from Europe had wrought. Here was a melting pot, a mixture and blending of the building trades. Carpenters from Germany, stone cutters from Italy, iron workers from Sweden and Belgium, bricklayers from Ireland. They labored over a century to build a city the likes of which the world has never known. And their descendants build and rebuild it to this day. At Midtown Manhattan, Mrs. Johnson received a bon voyage from two distinguished visitors. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, accompanied by Mrs. Rockefeller, and New York City's young mayor, John Lindsay, and Mrs. Lindsay. Lawrence Rockefeller, director of the New York Council of Parks and Outdoor Recreation, gave some background on a proposed park along a Hudson side stream, the Harlem River. The first 4 acres would cost nearly $1 million. National Park Service Director George Hartzog presented a federal grant for half the amount. In matching the federal check with state funds and private donations, New York could start immediately to bring the plan to reality. The Hudson's deep waters and long navigable stretches were instrumental in opening up the continent. Early fur traders told of the great lands to the north and to the west. Soon, settlers in a mass migration moved up the Hudson, following the sun across the westward reaches of the Mohawk Valley to Ohio and beyond. In exploring the Hudson, Mrs. Johnson could have found no more knowledgeable guide than Lawrence Rockefeller, for the Rockefeller family has long been an active force in preserving the scenic and historic resources of the entire Hudson corridor. James Biddle, president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, pointed out one of the unique features of the Hudson shoreline: the many European-styled manors built along the river throughout the mid-1800s. The magnificent estate of Lyndhurst, open to the public, is a notable example. Later in her trip, Mrs. Johnson would spend a memorable evening at the famous mansion, acquainting herself with the paintings and the architecture associated with the Hudson's development, with particular emphasis upon the history lying behind these ornate homes. They offered a distinct departure from the Cape Cods, the salt boxes, and the federal styles of architecture so long associated with the young nation's growth. The great merchants and financiers of Manhattan, the city built by immigrant labor, found themselves laden with sudden wealth. They moved northward from New York City and planted along the banks of the Hudson an endless catalog of Italian villas, Greek temples, and Rhineland castles, collectively known as Hudson River Gothic. Many of these magnificent buildings still remain, but they are hidden and forgotten in the forested hillsides along the river. uncared for, waiting for the wrecker's axe, or more hopefully, for the preservationists who will restore them to their original splendor, making them available for the public's use. Even though the Hudson River is over 300 miles long, some of the richest experiences can be found waiting only 30 miles north of Manhattan, an hour's drive up the scenic parkway. Mrs. Johnson's first landing embodied the very spirit of the Hudson Valley, the area near Tarrytown made famous by the writings of Washington Irving in the early 1800s. Mrs. Johnson was met at Washington Irving's home by an enthusiastic gathering of local conservationists, historians, and active citizens dedicated to preserving Tarrytown's past. Irving's satirical sketches of the early New Yorkers and the Dutch communities along the Hudson firmly established him as the first internationally recognized man of American letters. He purchased Sunnyside as a retreat from his busy literary and social world, but the charming storybook home soon became a focal point for all the important writers, painters, and philosophers of his time. Although Washington Irving authored many volumes, none received such critical praise as his famous sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. An 1864 edition of the book was presented to Mrs. Johnson from Sleepy Hollow Restorations as a memento of her visit to Sunnyside. Mrs. Johnson's bookshelf was enlarged even further, this time by Carl Carmer, noted river historian, with an autographed edition of his definitive work on the Hudson. And to her delight, a young actor, Gedda Smith, would offer later in the day a spirited reading of her favorite story from the sketchbook, Rip Van Winkle. The inspiration for Irving's famous tale, and many of his others, was the hours spent as a child roaming the quiet forests in the Sleepy Hollow area.
On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening, but to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils or tendrils from tree to tree and spread a kind of network in his path. At length, he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater. But no traces of such opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall, over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest.
In contrast, Washington Irving drew upon the superstitious Dutch settlers for a seasoning of horror in some of his tales. Here, too, he was inspired by the local legends and landscape of Tarrytown, in particular the old Dutch church of Sleepy Hollow. Here, only a short distance from his beloved Sunnyside, in the heart of the cemetery he had made so famous, he found his final haven. Many who have devoted a lifetime to studying the Hudson say that these were her finest years. The river aristocrats created a well-ordered life centered around their quiet estates. The accent was upon writing, music, and painting. An endless flow of canvases sprang from the palettes of the Hudson painters. They violated classic forms of European composition and let their brushes respond almost emotionally to the rugged splendor of the valley. In their own time, they became internationally recognized as the Hudson River School. On a flower-lined brick path called the Long Walk, Mrs. Johnson looked further back into the river's history. Van Cortlandt Manor, a fully restored estate dating back to the 1600s, stands as a living example of life under the Dutch patroons, the first of the privileged landholders to settle and farm the Hudson Valley. Not only are the house and grounds authentically preserved, but the daily routine of life as well.
is from the cochineal insect, and it is one of the best sources of a really bright red. Now, we've been able to achieve certain degrees of red with the madder root, but this used to be called a turkey red.
Red comes spun and dyed. You have to plan on what to use in the loom. So you have to decide first on the size that you have to, for a towel, for instance, so wide and so long. Then you make the warp.
Van Cortlandt Manor's sheep-to-shawl demonstration takes the visitor through each step of garment making, as practiced in the earliest days of community life on the Hudson. The shearing, the carding, the spinning and weaving were all household tasks in the 1600s and 1700s, when clothing, as well as most other necessities, was handcrafted on the local estates. Mrs. Johnson was given the opportunity to literally take some of the fabric of history with her. A shawl, hand-woven from white wool sheared from a local ram, was presented to her as a gift from the Westchester County Hand Weavers Guild. The guild is formed by local women who share a fierce pride in their history and who are determined not to let the arts and crafts of their forebears fade away and be forgotten. One of Mrs. Johnson's most memorable stops was Boscobel. Its unique sound and light program dramatically portrays the changing life on the river and its effects on the house and its owners. Boscobel's most elegant era was captured by the First Lady of the American Theater, Helen Hayes.
I think that day was the climax of the rich, brief glory of Boscobel. And dancing was the favorite diversion of young and old, and the waltz, once considered indecent, was the most popular of all.
But Civil War brought tragedy to Boscobel, and as happened to many river families, fortunes took a turn for the worse. Estates fell into disrepair. Mrs. Johnson was met at Boscobel by Mr. and Mrs. DeWitt Wallace, noted patrons of Hudson restoration. They described how the once magnificent home was sold to a house wrecker for $35. Aided by a grant from citizens who sought to preserve their heritage, Boscobel was saved from oblivion. Today, it stands as the best example of the Robert Adam influence on American architecture. Its mantels, doorways, and decorative woodwork reflect the refinement and elegance of the Federal period. And Boscobel, like many of the other fine homes and historic sites along the Hudson, is today available to the public. A moment out of the past, painstakingly preserved for the enjoyment of future generations. Mrs. Johnson's trip up the historic Hudson had ended, but it had helped open new routes to making history more exciting and more accessible to the tourist. The First Lady had helped many people rediscover this great river of the mountains and its rich record faithfully preserved in architecture and prose, on canvas and in custom, illustrating one of the most colorful, adventurous, and romantic chapters in American history.